That is so dramatic. I mean, you can't. She's bathed in a red glow, and she's holding her bleeding head on her lap.
Of all his wives, Anne was the one Henry wanted to be forgotten. He had all trace of her removed, her emblems, her initials. He would hate the fact that she has the greatest following today.
Tracy, first of all, welcome to After Dark. We're absolutely delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Now, we know that part of your job is as a curator at historic royal palaces, as well as being an author of fantastic books. In that capacity, spending time in those historic buildings, some of which were familiar to Anne, have you ever seen a Tudor ghost?
Not seen. I have had one ghostly experience, potentially ghostly experience, who knows, in my, 15 years of working at historic royal palaces. Now, fittingly enough, I was on a ghost tour when this happened, and I was walking along, I'm not making this up, the haunted gallery at Hampton Court.
This is a little too...
I know, it's a bit too convenient. I'm not plugging our ghost story tools, I promise, but the haunted gallery is named after Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, whose unquiet spirit is said to run screaming along this stretch of the palace. Regardless of whether she does or doesn't, there have been more sightings, faintings along this corridor than anywhere else, either at Hampton Court or any of the other palaces. Now, I got halfway along the haunted gallery and the lights were out. And all of a sudden, it was as if I'd stepped into a deep freeze. It was the temperature plummeted. And I looked around me for a source of draft, window, door, nothing, solid wall. And then just as suddenly the temperature went back up again. And I scarpered back along the corridor to rejoin my group. And the tour leader saw the look on my face and saw how pale I'd gone. He said, did something happen there? And what I described, he said, that basically so many people have said the same. On that single point, they can't find a source for such a dramatic fall in temperature. Yeah. But I keep an open mind. I would love to see a ghost. Never have, but that for me. But yeah, it definitely spooked me.
I think as historians, the idea that history is somehow proximate to us, that it's just there beyond some kind of veil. It's a very tantalising idea, isn't it? And I think we all would like to see a ghost. Exactly.
I love the idea that people leave something of themselves, that walls have some kind of memory, that some impression of the person, of the event lives on. Of course it defies science, and I deal with a lot of skeptics in my job, and I'm sure everything can really be explained, but I just love the prospect that some things can't.
One of the things that makes us most jealous about your job, Tracy, is that you get to spend an awful lot of time in some incredibly world famous historic sites. So if you don't mind, let's take listeners back to the 19th of May 1536.
Anne Boleyn, the infamous second wife of Henry VIII, was led from her apartments inside the tower, the short walk to the scaffold that had been built for her execution. She had been condemned for adultery and treason, and she was led there. She mounted the steps of the scaffold, and a great crowd had gathered. It was supposed to be a private execution, but the doors of the tower had been left open, and a great crowd had gathered, about 1,000 people, to witness the final moments of Anne Boleyn. And she delivered a speech praising Henry VIII, her husband, who had sent her to her death. And then she knelt and started to pray. And the swordsman whom Henry had thoughtfully sent for from Calais to dispatch his second wife swung the sword once above his head to gain purchase, and then decapitated Anne with a single stroke. And her body was bundled into an old arrow chest. They apparently hadn't thought to get a coffin. I think probably nobody expected Henry to go through with this. And she was buried without ceremony 3 hours later in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, which is the Tower Chapel. And there she lies to this day.
It's such a moment of real trauma obviously for Anne to have to go through that and to meet her end in that way, but trauma for England, for the political situation in that moment, this idea that there were people thinking, there would be maybe a last-minute reprieve for Anne and that she would get away. Am I right in thinking that she certainly hoped for that herself, and she walked onto that scaffold thinking, any moment now, Henry will change his mind?
Yes, I firmly believe nobody thought he would go through with this. That's why there were lots of elements that went wrong, the leaving open the tower doors, the fact they hadn't got a coffin. And you're quite right, Maddy, in that as Anne was walking to the scaffold, she was seen to keep looking over her shoulder as if, where's this messenger with my pardon from the king? And I think it's likely that the day before her execution, so we know that Henry had sent Archbishop Cranmer to persuade Anne to agree to an annulment. Why would she? I think Henry offered her life. So, if you agree to this, I will spare you. We don't know for sure, but I certainly think Anne was expecting that this was just some terrible lesson she was being taught and she would be reprieved.
It says so much about her as a person as well, doesn't it? That she was so strong and determined that she held out till the end, even if she thought there was hope that she would get away.
That's a really interesting point as well, though, that Maddy, that you brought up about this kind of trauma for England and potentially trauma that still endures for some people. I think particularly people who feel some kind of connection with Anne Boleyn and Anne Boleyn's history. It also talks a little bit about like testing the boundaries of kingship and queenship in turn, and there's a flux involved there, I guess, that's trying at the time. If you're a contemporary on the ground in the 1530s, there is so much push and pull happening at the Tudor court that I wonder if it's causing disruption as to where this might land. Tracy, what do you think? Was there doubt and confusion about what he was doing?
Absolutely. No Queen of England had ever been executed. This was a moment. This was huge, even by Henry VIII standards. People had got used to him causing a bit of turmoil by now. And we know Anne was tried at the Tower in the Great Hall. It no longer exists. Neither do her private apartments where she was kept. But during her trial, so she entered the courtroom to hostility, a wave of hostility. Everyone there saw her as this Scarlet Woman, usurper. They wanted her to die. But she changed the mood of that courtroom with her defence, and she was so eloquent, so articulate. I think everyone there in that courtroom realised this had been a grave miscarriage of justice. She'd been wrongfully accused. So this could have gone either way. Her execution, this could have prompted something quite dangerous, I think, for Henry. And there's a danger of hindsight. We know, he gets away with it. He's betrothed to the next wife the following day. But I think it could easily have gone very wrong for Henry.
Yeah.
It says something about who she was as a person and that she was so dignified, or at least
yes,
I'm sure that she was in reality completely terrified and panicking inside, but that she was able to present herself in this way and to give herself a voice and a platform when women in this era, I mean, of course she's the King of England, the Queen of England even, of course she's the Queen of England, so she has a platform in a way that other women don't, but she is living and meets her death in an era when women don't have that much power and that much control over their own lives and their own voices. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why we have this cultural idea of her ghost. And we're going to talk about some of the locations that she supposedly appears in. But I think there's something there about her enduring beyond her death, and that she's so powerful that we still feel these traces of her today.
Yes.
And of course, that's something that really comes in, I mean, possibly, in the days after her death, that people are so interested in that moment and that trauma. But certainly by the 19th century, there's a real interest in, I suppose you could call it sort of Tudor horror, really, in the guts and gore of the period, and in these political and emotional machinations that are going on around Henry and his wives. But I wonder, Tracy, if you can sort of maybe speculate a little bit about why in the 19th century, and really until today, why are we so obsessed with Tudor history? And I'm sure as an author who's written so extensively about the Tudor period, you can really attest to this, that there is a really enduring interest in this period and in Anne in particular. Why is that, do you
There
think?
is. It's interesting that this really gets going during the Victorian period. Although I would argue that the sort of Anne Boleyn the cult of Anne Boleyn starts in the reign of her daughter Elizabeth, who really focuses so much on rehabilitating her mother, putting her back to the place she deserves in history as this quite extraordinary woman, visionary queen. But the Victorians, they really latched onto this, and Anne just caught their imagination. I think some of that might have to do with a particular author, historian from the Victorian period, Agnes Strickland, who wrote her multi-volume Lives of the Queens of England, and she spent a lot of time on Anne Boleyn and the other Tudor queens as well, and it was a hugely popular work. And actually we see most of the ghost stories associated not just with Anne, but the other 6 queens. In fact, the other palace ghosts generally, we can't trace them much further back than the Victorian period. This is when it really gets going. They have this love of the sort of the dark world beyond what may be seen. But Anne Boleyn, it's interesting that she caught the imagination of the Victorians, because I think why we love her today is she's so relatable. She seems so modern. She came from a world dominated by men, where women were literally seen as inferior in every single respect. But Anne does not fit that mould. She has ideas. She's outspoken. She's feisty. And she doesn't conform. And ultimately, that's a big part of why she falls, quite apart from not giving Henry the son. But the Victorians loved that too, and I guess that was an age they had a woman on the throne. So even though we see the Victorians as very conventional and kind of buttoned up, I guess it chimed with them.
And it comes back to what you were saying, Anthony, about Anne Boleyn's story being so connected with kingship and with queenship especially. And it's no surprise, therefore, that the Victorians would find that resonant, I suppose. It's interesting to me that it's the 19th century and particularly the Victorians who have the majority of these encounters with Anne Boleyn's ghost. I think there's another story from the Tower specifically. And I guess we can talk about the Tower as this sort of, I don't know, I suppose a site of cultural memory and imagination more broadly. But there's a story of one of the guardsmen there who comes around a corner one night, on duty, and he sees the ghost of, who he takes to be Anne Boleyn, a headless female figure moving towards him, and he readies his bayonet and challenges it. And when the figure just continues to come towards him and actually moves through him, he tries to bayonet it and he faints when he can't do that. And I think actually he's found then passed out on duty, which I think probably would
No, it was a ghost, Maddie. It was a ghost.
Yeah, I think
It
it's
was
a very
definitely
good
a ghost.
excuse.
He
isn't
definitely
it?
hadn't been drinking, and it definitely wasn't anything normal. It had to have been a ghost.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's a very reasonable excuse for being asleep on duty. But there's something there about people maybe wanting to see these things, expecting to see them. And I suppose at the Tower in particular, because it's a site that is almost quite literally soaked in the blood of so many really formative figures of British history.
It's so atmospheric. I've spent a lot of time at the Tower after dark, and whether or not you believe in ghosts, it has a fairly unique atmosphere, and you can almost sort of breathe in the history. And just for me, it's a huge privilege just walking the footsteps of Anne Boleyn, of the other people who were so strongly associated with the Tower. And just going back to the Victorians, they had a fascination with the Tower of London in particular. This is when it really enters its heyday as a tourist attraction. And I love the fact the Victorians did love the Tower, but for them it wasn't quite medieval enough. So they sort of re-medievalised the Tower, pulling down 13th century walls and rebuilding them as they thought they should be.
Wow.
And so actually a lot of the Tower that we see today was the construct of the Victorians.
That's so do you know, I didn't know that. It's so interesting that it gets a sort of theme park treatment
Yes,
almost.
yes.
Yeah, really interesting.
And if you go to the Tower today, and I don't know if I should admit this, and you see the memorial to Anne Boleyn and the other people people executed inside the tower, because there aren't many of those. There's only, I think, about 11 people. The rest were on Tower Hill, the site of the tube station. That memorial for Anne Boleyn is in the wrong place. She wasn't executed on Tower Green. She was executed right outside where you go and see the Crown Jewels, in between the Jewel House and the White Tower. And you won't see any memorial, any trace, but that actually was the spot.
Gosh.
So, listeners, yes, next time you're at the tower, go to that. Just beneath the clock where you go in to see the Crown Jewels, that was the site.
And
of
the queue for a
execution.
photograph there will be shorter.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Wow. And so was that a Victorian choice to?
It was
place that
partly.
there?
We can't completely blame the Victorians, because that's actually quite it's a modern glass memorial
Sure.
that was placed there. And the confusion came because Henry VIII, this is the thing that chills me more than any ghost story. In the National Archives, which is such a treasure trove, there's a warrant sent by Henry to Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, with detailed instructions for Anne's execution. Anybody who says, it wasn't really Henry pulling the strings, it so was. He was very particular about the details, and he stipulated that it must be on the green in the Tower of London. Well, today the green is just part of it, but it would have extended much further and around to in front of the Crown Jewel House. And that's why the confusion is they just focused on the bit of green that still exists today.
Right, wow, gosh.
It's interesting as well that you were talking earlier about elements of Anne Boleyn's personality or her archive that appeals to people today. And it got me thinking as you were speaking about the elements of her personality that might have specifically appealed to Victorians, even though some of her attributes may seem counter-Victorian almost. But I suppose she was a dedicated wife in many ways, and that would have appealed. It's just interesting to think about how multifaceted she is, and so can endure over these generations.
And she shapeshifts throughout time. We make her
what we need her to be.
We need her to be.
Yes.
She is a mirror to our own society, I think.
Yes, she is. Yeah. She is. So I think you're absolutely right in that she would have been sort of celebrated as a wife. And that final speech of hers, full of praise for the man who's putting her to death. By the way, I think that's all for Elizabeth. Anne wants Henry to look kindly on those she leaves behind. And you see this with scaffold speeches. People don't tend to criticise the monarch. But the Victorians, I think, as well, admired Anne as a mother. I think they admired her piety because she was described in Elizabeth's reign as the root of the Reformation. And would Henry have even gone down the path of reform had it not been for Anne Boleyn? And of course, the Victorian period was a very God-fearing period as well. So you're right. She does shapeshift. We pick certain elements, and today it's more the feistiness and the kind of girl power, if I can say that. I'm a devotee of the musical Six. Can I just say I've seen it 7 times.
I've never seen it.
You need to go immediately, and that gives you the ultimate modern Anne Boleyn, feisty, kind of almost Essex girl, the way it's portrayed. But she is so brilliant in that. Definitely not a Victorian Anne Boleyn, though, in the musical Six.
I wonder what she will be next for people in the future.
Yes.
Interesting.
She will shapeshift again. She will continue. And that's why we continue to be fascinated by her. I love it because of all his wives, Anne was the one Henry wanted to be forgotten. He had all trace of her removed, her emblems, her initials. He would hate the fact that she has the greatest following today.
Tracy, can you just tell us, first of all, we've moved now from the Tower of London to Hever Castle, which is in Kent. I have never been to Hever, to my great shame. So can you just set the scene a little bit for us? What is this building like?
Oh, Hever is one of my favourite places on earth. It is the most beautiful manor house, moated manor house. If you were to design sort of medieval moated manor house, it would be Hever. Very romantic, beautiful grounds. Now we know, like the tower, it has been altered by the Astors, who took over Hever Castle many years after Anne Boleyn. But the heart of it is still there, and the rooms that Anne would have known. So it's an incredibly atmospheric place. And what I love about Hever is Anne Boleyn absolutely adored it. It was so formative in her history. She spent her childhood there. She wasn't actually born there, but it was certainly her childhood home. And it was also where her relationship with Henry unfolded. She kind of used it as a refuge, I think. I'm not sure how much she wanted Henry. And you see her returning to Hever quite a lot as he's pursuing her. And sometimes he goes after her there at Hever. And even once, she's almost queen, she's still escaping to Hever whenever she can. And so for me, there's such a strong resonance there with Anne. And you certainly, if you believe in such things, kind of feel Anne's presence throughout Hever. It's the most beautiful place. I can tell you as well, you are allowed to stay there. They have they have rooms. Wow. I would highly recommend, and you get the whole place to yourself after dark.
We must go and record an episode.
I think you need to
Producer
justify
Freddie is in a corner, and we are putting this on the list for a future episode.
Business expense, justifiable. It is amazing. Now, a dear friend of mine was the curator at Hever, Owen Emerson, and he shared with me a ghost story because I've been doing a lot of research at Hever. I've been sort of not living there, but spending so much time there. And Owen told me, and for me, it's always when it's out of the horse's mouth that it's most powerful, about this occasion when he was with a friend and they were exploring Hever together. And his friend said, "Look, just Boleyns, if you can hear me, give me a sign," kind of flippantly. All the lights started to flicker.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
And then this light appeared in an upstairs window that they could see, and they both went to investigate. Nobody there. Light had disappeared. They were the only ones in the castle. Now, you might say, yeah. Now, Owen is a straight-up guy. He's not going to make up a story like that. I completely believe him. And yeah, it really gave me shivers down the spine when he told me. And he said he just couldn't explain it. It's the only thing that's happened, and it was just in response to literally a plea. Come on, show yourselves.
And it must have been amazing for him as the curator of that building, someone who's so familiar with its spaces and its history, to experience it in a different way and to feel that connection potentially.
Yes, exactly. So, and I could just tell the look on his face as he was relating this story. It had clearly shaken him. It had, moved him because he's spent his life immersed in researching Anne, in her story, in where she lived. But this, I guess, gave it a whole other dimension.
It is that particularly that type of experience in that type of venue does speak to something along the lines of a supernatural element to heritage properties. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's manifestations of ghosts, but it's something otherworldly. I know on a personal level, when you go to a lot of these sites, there is just something different about setting foot in these places where the energy changes. I've said this to Maddy so many times. I'm a big one for touching surfaces, even sometimes when you're not supposed to. Please don't do that. And don't blame me.
Do that.
But there's something about the actual contact that they also made contact with. So, you talked about walking in footsteps of Anne Boleyn earlier, Tracy. It's sometimes just being on that same path, putting your hand on a jamb of a door that they may have rested their hand on. There's something supernatural for me about that, just in the feeling of it and how... again, I've spoken about this before in the podcast, but how history becomes present tense in that way. And so maybe that's just a manifestation of that in some way.
Absolutely. And you can't beat actually being in the spaces. So even though those spaces have changed, at Hampton Court, for example, my favourite room in the palace is it's called Apartment 33. We've got lots of apartments all named after the Grace and Favour residents in the Victorian period. And Apartment 33 is the room where Jane Seymour, Anne's nemesis, gave birth to the future Edward VI, and where she died a few days later. And it's been so much altered. We've got kind of Georgian panelling. We've got flip charts. It's an HR training room today. It's not open to the public. But you still get that sense, and you're standing where history happened, if you like. And for me, that's irreplaceable as an experience. We as historians spend a lot of time in libraries and online researching, but there's something about being in the space.
There really is. And there's something as well about it does alter your research, I think, and your perception of that time period or that person. If you're writing about them, going into that space, you can realise, the view from the window that they could see wasn't exactly what I thought it was, or they could see this landmark in London. You think about Anne in the Tower. What buildings could she see?
Yes.
Could she see her own gallows being constructed? And being in that space gives you some of those answers, and it allows you to, I guess, have a closeness to the people in the past.
Yes.
And whether or not that is supernatural or paranormal, for me, it doesn't really matter. I think it is that proximity that it gives you as a researcher and just as a member of the public to go into these spaces.
I think there's no substitute for it. And on the subject of Anne Boleyn and spaces she would have known, if there's one myth I would like to bust during this podcast,
Please do.
It's where she was kept, because until recent times, everybody went to the Queen's house, and I've heard people say it myself on tours. It's called the Queen's house after Anne Boleyn because this is where she was housed. It's that kind of timber-framed building, which is the constable's residence now, on Tower Green. It wasn't there. It was in the old Royal Palace, which now demolished. So on the kind of green next to the White Tower, where the ravens' cages are actually now. But it no longer exists. And actually the Queen's house was not named after Anne Boleyn. It was named, or still is named after, the reigning sovereign. So it's now the King's house.
Right.
So it changes with with each monarch if there's a change of gender of monarch. So there you go. I'm afraid what was called the Queen's house is now the King's house. Has nothing to do with where Anne Boleyn. And therefore, because I read a lot as well, she looked out of her windows to see the 5 men accused with her being executed. She could not possibly have had any view of Tower Hill, the execution site, from her apartments.
Wow.
I love busting a myth.
We love that. We do love that. Okay, so we've had Anne in the Tower. We've had Anne at Hever. And now we're going to go to Blickling Hall in Norfolk.
I actually haven't heard of Blickling Hall. So how does that fit into Anne Boleyn's story?
Well, it's where she was born, almost
Right.
certainly. For a while, Blickling and Hever kind of fought it out between them. No, we're the birthplace, we're the birthplace. But I think even Hever now acknowledged they're the childhood home, but the Boleyns were a Norfolk family, and Blickling was one of their sort of power bases, if you like. So it's likely that Anne was born at Blickling. And So, okay, full disclosure. I know this story intimately because people still gather on the 19th of May at night to see this apparition, okay? And I went there one year, not necessarily expecting to see it, but I thought, I just want to know what this is all about. And I love Blickling. Shameless plug alert. My very first book was about Henrietta Howard, a mistress of George II, and she was born at Blickling. So I kind of came to Blickling through the Georgians and then discovered the Anne Boleyn collection.
As two Georgian historians, we have to say that anything through the Georgians is the best way.
But
Exactly.
I'm a little bit astounded by this. I did not know that you had come to the Tudors through the Georgians.
There you go, you see.
Do not underestimate the
Ge-
Georgians, guys.
I
You need to
love
check
the
them
Georgians.
out.
Please, can we do another podcast about something Georgian?
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes, we
Yeah,
can.
I'm about more than just the Tudors. But anyway, so I went there 19th of May, and there's this big gathering there every year, and they wait until midnight to see this carriage draw up with the headless Anne Boleyn. Well, needless to say, of course, it didn't appear, but I think it has the biggest following of all of the various ghost stories in terms of people actually turning out to see it and to be there and to believe it. Yet for me, it's the least believable of the ghost stories. The kind of carriage and the headlessness. I can more buy into the stories where Anne is as she was and not just kind of carrying her head around and Anne intact, and the sort of spirit of Anne I can get behind.
Yeah, it reduces her story to that one moment of her
Exactly.
being beheaded, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it must have been a really remarkable event to attend, Tracy. So can you just tell us a little bit, set the scene for us? Who are the kinds of people who attend an event like this expecting to see a headless Anne pulling up in a carriage?
Well, it was interesting. I would say the audience was largely made up of women. I think there might have been one long-suffering husband there, but mostly it was women, mostly sort of retired women, and I think most of those women were also from the kind of local area. I was viewed with some suspicion because I was clearly not a regular on the
Okay.
19th of May every year. So people didn't know why I was there. There was, I would say, 30 to 40 people there.
Okay.
So decent sized gathering. We gathered outside the gates to Blickling. It was actually a really atmospheric evening because there was a bit of mist. It was
Love it.
one of those, of course there had to be. Probably it was fake mist, but I fell for
Being
it totally.
shoved in
Yes,
by-
exactly, by the National Trust.
Smoke machine round the corner.
Yeah, and I just absolutely lapped that up. And I remember as well just the silence. There was a bit of chatter when everybody gathered, and then there was just silence for the half an hour leading up to midnight. And I did get a bit spooked. I didn't expect to see the carriage or the headless ghost, but it was atmospheric, and I just thought it felt more respectful than ghoulish, if that makes sense. It felt that these women really connected with Anne Boleyn and her story, and really wanted to mark that, and not just that it wasn't just full of eager-eyed ghost hunters. It was more about respecting Anne Boleyn
And remembering her.
and remembering her. So midnight came, and the clock chimed, and it was all very spine tingling, and then people just quietly dispersed, and that was it. So I found it quite moving, and I'm pleased I experienced it, not as a ghostly kind of activity, but more just to remember Anne in a place that has a strong connection with her.